So here's our last stop, has to do with Union Square. It took its name in 1861 at the beginning of the most tumultuous four-year period in American history, the American Civil War, the chief issue of which was substantially the issue of slavery. But that wasn't the exciting instance actually of the war. Abraham Lincoln launched the war because he said no part of the United States can unilaterally withdraw from the United States. Most of the opposition to slavery in the North was on account of economic opportunity. It was not to liberate the black man or black woman. The concern was, well, here's the United States, New York, San Francisco in 1861. Here's the Mississippi River. The concern was that if slavery moved to this area, white workers would have to compete with black slaves for jobs. The concern was an economic one. It wasn't slavery is wrong, it was slavery will make my wages go down. In any event, California was settled by half of the population of California was from the south, half from the north. So there was a movement in 1861 at the outset of the American Civil War to divide California into two states. A southern portion of the state that would go with the Confederacy, northern part, of course, would stay with the United States of America. There was a plebiscite held, a popular vote, and the major discussions were held in this plaza, Union Square. It was so named because, well, what you're soon to hear. In order to persuade the 4% of the vote, which was going to decide the election, again, 48% firmly for keeping the country together, one state, about 48% firmly for dividing the state, 4% of the vote would decide it. The Unitarians brought from Boston a abolitionist, that is someone opposed to slavery but who was a minister, a fellow named, and you'll recognize the name probably, Thomas Starr King. Yes, okay, so he was known as a abolitionist and as a great speaker and advocate of the end of slavery. He was brought to California and he lectured here in San Francisco but also up and down the state, persuading that 4% to vote for Union, and he was successful. He's given credit for that. And the result was the naming after his death of this square, Union Square, in honor of keeping the state in union with the United States. The great irony of the square, though, is that in the middle of the plaza is the Dewey Monument. That's the column, surmounted by a female figure who's holding up a trident, representing Poseidon, king of the sea, the Greek god of the ocean. And this is the Dewey Monument because it celebrates the naval victory of Admiral Dewey in Manila Harbor in the Philippines, sinking the Spanish Pacific Fleet. That was a good thing in this regard. The Spanish for 300 years had dominated the Philippines, had occupied and dominated that, and it was certainly time for the Spanish to leave. The background to that story is of interest, at least to we in the Americas. The Spanish had come to the Americas. Conquistadors had, among other places, taken possession of Potosi, the largest silver mine in the world, still productive in Colombia and still producing at this time. It had been used by the Incas as a mine, using other slave Indian labor before the Spanish arrived, but after the Spanish arrived, it was then Incan labor that was used to extract the silver. That silver was taken by Spanish vessel to China to exchange for high-end products. The silver was the exchange product. But the Chinese did not want Europeans in China. So they said, you have to meet us at a neutral site. And that neutral site was Manila, as it turns out. At that time, there was no nation, the Philippines. Instead, there were over 100 different kingdoms on the different islands. And the Spanish, when they sent their ferry, I guess it was their second galleon full of silver to the Philippines, it was pirated. And so the Spanish decided, well, we don't want that to happen again. So what we will do is we will work with, as it turned out, about 19 families in the Philippines, native peoples, to consolidate those island kingdoms into one principality that will become the country with which we'll have to deal with. And what they offered that family was something like 10% of all the silver if you will stop the piracy, and that's what the result was. Incidentally, the name the Philippines is derived from the name of the then King of Spain, Philip. So it's actually an Asian country named for a European dominator. That persisted for the next 300 years until in the early 1870s, a more powerful resistance to the Spanish occupation arose, and it was inspired and led by a Jesuit priest, a fellow named Jose Rizal, who happens to have visited San Francisco. Although he himself was nonviolent, his words inspired the resistance movement. He was captured by the Spanish and executed on that account, at which point the resistance said, well, Jesus didn't help us enough, we're going to take up the gun. And so the armed resistance in earnest began at that time, 1894 or so, which was the perfect time, as it turned out, for the United States to enter the fray and nominally say, we are freedom fighters, just as in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we're going to help liberate this country from the forces of oppression. But that was duplicitous. It was about something very different, as it turns out. The war was really about Havana. The United States declared that we have to help liberate those poor Filipino people from the Spanish. But to do that, we can't just fight the Spanish over there in the Philippines. We have to fight them everywhere we find them overseas, and that includes in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. And so the whole debacle really begins in 1896 when the then President of the United States, McKinley, sends the Navy and the armies or representative forces volunteer forces under Theodore Roosevelt into Cuba and liberates Cuba from the Spanish. That's really what the war was about. The problem was, you've liberated the Philippines and the Filipinos are grateful for that, but now how do you extract yourself? Very similar in some respects to Iraq. How do you extract yourself? And there were economic interests which didn't want to be extracted. The model for the female figure was the wife of Spreckels, who was the sugar baron of the United States. And Filipino sugar production was depressing the price of California sugar. And so it wasn't the major reason, but one reason the United States remained in the Philippines was to continue suppressing sugar production there so that price of sugar, California-based and Hawaiian-based, would remain high. So it was an overt of economic colonialism, indeed, but that was. And then you factor in the other piece, which was the war was also about extracting or evicting Spain from the Caribbean, and it becomes a messy piece altogether. The resistance took up arms against the United States occupation, and a war ensued that lasted about 10 years. Over 200,000 Filipinos died due to American bullets. Most of them fired by Filipinos working for the Filipino families that were working in conjunction with the U.S. interests. But so it was Filipino against Filipino as much as American forces fighting against Filipino insurgents. But there we have this irony of a plaza dedicated to no slavery, freedom, Union Square, having in its midst a memorial to American-style colonialism. And I would put it out there that this was an instance of land colonialism. This is really what this was about, not necessarily directly owning, but controlling the economic value of the land underneath other peoples. When the two stations open, rents will go up another 5 to 7%, and more businesses will go out. I paid for this, and you paid for this project through taxes, and yet the real beneficiaries, if you just follow the money, are the landowners in Chinatown. What Henry George proposed was to tax away that land value. As it increases, pay for this project, and not tax the small business owners for having their small businesses and putting them out.